You know, when you think about building a house, there's usually a very clear, logical sequence of events.
Right, yeah, you prepare the foundation, you frame the walls.
Exactly. You put on the roof, and eventually you walk through the front door.
It's a very linear process. I mean, you start from scratch and you build something entirely new on an empty plot of land.
But imagine trying to completely rebuild that same house, tear down its toxic foundations, and fundamentally change its architecture, all while the people who live there are, like, still trapped inside.
Wow. Yeah, that is an incredibly tense, almost impossible scenario. You're trying to engineer a new reality while still being confined by the walls of the old one.
And right now, today, August 1st, 2026, Emancipation Day in Jamaica,
Yeah.
that is exactly what the country is attempting to do.
Yeah, it's a monumental task.
It really is. So, welcome to today's deep dive. Today, we're looking at a profoundly thought-provoking piece of independent journalism. It's titled Freedom's Unfinished House by Dean Jones, and it was published in Jamaica Homes News.
And this isn't going to be your standard historical recap, is it?
Not at all. Our goal for you listening today is to really unpack the incredibly complex reality of Jamaica's emancipation. We want to discover why the fight for reparations is escalating right now in the year 2026.
Right. The current legal push is fascinating.
And we're also going to explore how the very definition of home in Jamaica is bridging the gap between its ancestral roots and, hyper-digital, AI-driven future. So, okay, let's unpack this. The author uses that powerful metaphor of the trapped house to destroy this persistent myth that freedom was just handed down on a specific date.
Yeah, wrapped in a neat little bow.
Exactly. But when you look at the actual timeline of abolition, there is a shocking gap between the promise of freedom and the grim reality on the ground.
Oh, absolutely. The gap is entirely structural. So Britain passed the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833, right? And its principal provisions were supposed to take effect on August 1st, 1834.
Okay, but it wasn't a magic switch.
Not even close. If you were an enslaved Jamaican on that day, you did not wake up free. I mean, only children under the age of 6 were truly declared free.
Wait, only children under 6?
Yeah. Anyone older than 6 was immediately rebranded under a new legal term. They were called an apprentice.
An apprentice. I mean, that sounds like finishing a grueling, exploitative employment contract, but management legally forces you to stay on for 4 more years under a new job title, doing the exact same unpaid labor, and just calls it an internship.
That is unfortunately a very accurate analogy.
But how is that actually enforced? Like, if Parliament says slavery is officially over, how do you legally compel someone to keep working for free?
Through a highly coordinated system of state coercion, under this so-called apprenticeship system, individuals were legally required to continue working for their former enslavers for over 40 hours a week.
With 0 wages.
0 wages.
Like,
And to enforce this, the British government created a completely new class of law enforcement called stipendiary magistrates. These were officials brought in primarily from Britain, ostensibly to act as, neutral judges between the apprentice and the planters.
I'm gonna guess they weren't exactly neutral.
Far from it. These magistrates were dropped into a hostile colonial environment where they often had to rely on the plantation owners for housing, for food, social interaction.
So they were completely compromised from day one.
Exactly.
Hmm.
So when a formerly enslaved person resisted this unpaid apprenticeship, these magistrates handed down brutal punishments.
Wow.
We are talking about forced labor on treadmills, in newly built workhouses, physical beatings. The legal architecture changed, sure, but the mechanism of extracting free labor was preserved through state-sanctioned violence.
That is just awful.
Yeah, full, complete freedom didn't actually arrive until August 1st, 1838.
So this completely shatters the myth of the benevolent British emancipator. I mean, the British Parliament didn't just wake up one day and decide to do the right thing out of the goodness of their hearts.
Yeah, well, not at all.
If freedom wasn't a gift, it must have been a concession to pressure. And the source actually mentions Tacky's revolt in St. Mary way back in 1760.
Right, and that resistance established a baseline of constant pressure. Decades later, that pressure peaked with the 1831 Christmas Uprising.
Which is famously known as the Baptist War, right?
Exactly, led by Samuel Daddy Sharp, who was an enslaved Baptist deacon. What's fascinating here is his original strategy.
Because Sharp originally envisioned this as a massive labor withdrawal, like a peaceful strike.
Yes, he just wanted people to refuse to work until they were granted freedom and a living wage. He clearly understood the economic vulnerability of the plantation system.
But a peaceful strike didn't stay peaceful.
Well, the colonial response to a peaceful strike was so incredibly violent that the situation escalated. It turned into the largest uprising of enslaved people in the history of the British Caribbean.
We're talking up to 60,000 Jamaicans involved, right?
Yes, 60,000. And the military suppression was absolute. Hundreds were executed, and Samuel Sharp himself was hanged in Montego Bay on May 23, 1832.
But his strategy actually worked in the long run. I mean, he changed the fundamental calculus for the British Empire.
He absolutely did. It made the cost of maintaining the institution higher than the profits it was generating.
The military cost to repeatedly suppress these massive rebellions, the economic cost of burned cane fields.
Right. The destroyed property and the political cost back in London. It all reached a breaking point. Sharp and others like him negotiated freedom under extreme pressure. They created conditions that simply forced Britain's hand.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, for everyone listening. If freedom was a forced negotiation, the terms of that settlement were entirely one-sided. The 1834 abolition came with a staggering financial payout.
Staggering is the right word.
The British government approved £20 million in compensation. But that money, it did not go to the people who had been enslaved.
No, it went entirely to the slave owners.
Yeah.
As compensation for the loss of their human, quote-unquote, property.
To understand the scale of that wealth transfer, that £20 million represented about 40% of Britain's entire annual government budget at the time.
40%. It's almost unimaginable today. And over $6 million of that went specifically to Jamaican slave owners and estate investors.
Just massive amounts of capital.
And the mechanism of this payment is crucial to understand. It wasn't just handed over in cash. It was often distributed as government bonds.
Oh, so they could earn interest on it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Those financial instruments were then used by the enslavers to build railways, fund merchant banks, and establish massive intergenerational wealth in Britain.
Meanwhile, the formerly enslaved people, the ones who had endured generations of unpaid labor, received absolutely zero. Zero land, zero capital.
Nothing.
And the author argues that this specific economic event is why reparations aren't just about, something dreadful from a long time ago.
Right.
It's about a highly specific, state-sponsored financial payout where all the wealth flowed to the oppressors, creating an economic gap that literally never closed.
Which brings us directly to the diplomatic actions happening right now, this very week.
Yes. Fast forward to September 6th, 2026. A Jamaican delegation is heading to Britain to present a formal petition to King Charles III.
And they are asking the king to refer legal questions concerning the legality of slavery and Britain's continuing responsibility for redress to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council.
Which, for some context, the Privy Council sits in London and acts as the final and highest court of appeal for Jamaica and several other Commonwealth nations.
Right, and the specific date of this petition, September 6th, is heavy with historical trauma.
Yeah, it's the anniversary of the 1781 departure of the Zong. That was a slave ship where more than 130 captive Africans were intentionally thrown overboard.
Just horrifying. But why focus on the Zong specifically for a legal petition about reparations?
Well, because the Zong massacre wasn't just a mass murder, it was an insurance fraud case. The owners of the ship murdered those people specifically so they could file a claim and recover insurance money for lost cargo.
And the British legal system at the time entertained that claim. They legally reduced human lives to financial instruments. So the delegation is using that anniversary to challenge the very legal foundation that categorized humans as property in the first place.
I mean, this is a constitutionally wild situation. You have an independent country, Jamaica, officially petitioning its own head of state because the British monarch remains the head of state in Jamaica over massive historical injustices committed under that exact same imperial authority.
It is a profound diplomatic maneuver. I mean, they aren't just sending an invoice. They are using the architecture of the British legal system against itself.
That is so strategic.
Yeah. By petitioning the Privy Council, they are asking the highest judicial body to formally evaluate the continuing modern legal liability of the British state for historical wealth extraction.
And Jamaica isn't doing this in a vacuum. I mean, this legal push aligns with a massive global shift that we saw earlier this year.
Right, back in March.
Yeah. In March 2026, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution defining chattel slavery as the gravest crime against humanity. This passed with 123 votes, including the support of all CARICOM member states.
That's the Caribbean community, for those listening.
But legally speaking, why does the phrase crime against humanity matter so much? Like, why couldn't they just call it a profound historical tragedy?
Because the phrasing is the entire mechanism. Under customary international law, a crime against humanity carries a very specific legal weight. It generally bypasses the statute of limitations.
Oh, wow. So time doesn't run out.
Exactly. When a government commits a standard crime, there is usually a time limit on when you can sue them for damages. But by having the UN formally recognize chattel slavery as a crime against humanity, nations are laying the legal groundwork to argue that the passage of 200 years does not extinguish the legal liability for redress.
That explains the timing of the next event. Just 3 months later, in June 2026, representatives from Africa and the Caribbean met in Accra, Ghana.
And they adopted a 19-point global framework for reparatory justice.
Right. They are demanding formal apologies, compensation, debt relief, and the return of artifacts and human remains.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we are watching the movement for reparatory justice rapidly evolve from memory to machinery.
Mm.
It is no longer just about building monuments or giving speeches on anniversaries.
It's structural now.
Very structural. The framework in Accra is about creating binding diplomatic alliances and establishing tribunals. They are building the international institutional structures required to actually enforce debt cancellation and wealth transfers.
So what does this all mean for the concept of home? Because if we contrast that global machinery with post-1838 Jamaica, the newly freed people didn't have a UN resolution.
No, they didn't have a legal team in London.
They had to find their own immediate form of repair, and they did it by claiming physical space. It seems like building a house wasn't just about having a roof. It was literally the only way to build intergenerational wealth from scratch after being shut out of that £20 million payout.
Access to land became the most practical, tangible measure of freedom. I mean, they didn't just want the legal status of not being property. They wanted absolute control over their own labor and their families.
But the plantation owners colluded, right? They refused to sell land to the formerly enslaved to force them back into low-wage plantation labor.
Yes. So how do they actually get the land to build these free villages that Dean Jones talks about in the source? Places like Sligoville, Sturgetown, Buxton, and Clarksonville?
They used proxies. Baptist missionaries who were allied with the abolitionist movement used funds from overseas to purchase large, bankrupt plantation estates.
That is so clever.
Right.
Yeah.
And then they subdivided that land and sold small plots to the formerly enslaved people. And these people had spent years secretly saving small amounts of money from selling produce at Sunday markets.
So moving away from the plantations and securing a plot of land was a declaration of absolute independence. In these free villages, homes, churches, and farms all emerged together. They built an entirely new society outside the economic control of their former captors.
As the author notes, emancipation gave Jamaicans ownership of themselves, but it did not give them a share of the land or the wealth they had created.
And that structural inequality from 1838 is still vibrating today, because secure land tenure and access to affordable housing are still incredibly pressing issues for many Jamaican families. They're still trying to build securely on that unfinished foundation.
Which brings us to the crossroads Jamaica is facing right now in 2026. We've seen how the Jamaican home was historically built brick by brick as a sanctuary of freedom. But now, as Jamaica enters this hyper-digital era, things are changing fast.
Very fast.
The landscape is transforming with new highways, digital banking, automation, and AI. The challenge is protecting that hard-won cultural identity from being overwritten by rapid modernization.
The integration of PropTech property technology is radically shifting the real estate landscape there. PropTech platforms use artificial intelligence to map real estate, offer virtual tours, provide automated algorithmic valuations.
Right, which means the Jamaican diaspora, or really any international investor, can browse, purchase, and manage local real estate from London or New York without ever stepping foot on the island.
The physical isolation of the Caribbean is essentially being erased by digital connectivity.
But Dean Jones issues a huge cultural warning here. He argues that technology should enlarge Jamaican life, not erase it.
Right. The preservation of identity is key.
He says traditional foods like ackee and saltfish, yam, and breadfruit shouldn't just become museum pieces replaced by imported convenience. I love the imagery he uses when he says, the Colonel should not be permitted to evict Grandma from her own kitchen.
It gets right to the heart of the anxiety around globalization.
I love that imagery, but let me play devil's advocate here for a second.
Sure.
Can a country rapidly adopt AI integrate into global digital real estate markets, and modernize at breakneck speed without inevitably losing some of its traditional, slow-paced cultural soul. I mean, isn't some level of cultural erasure just the price of admission to the global economy today?
This raises an important question, but the author's stance is that modernization does not require cultural amnesia. It is a genuine threat, though, and it goes far beyond losing traditional recipes.
How so?
When you allow global capital to dictate local real estate through AI and algorithms, you risk pricing out locals entirely. Algorithms scrape registry data to find undervalued coastal properties, marketing them instantly to high-net-worth individuals abroad.
Oh, wow. So the local Jamaican buyer is outbid before a for sale sign even goes up in the yard.
Exactly. The author's anxiety is about losing the actual demographic and cultural makeup of the island to international market forces.
So it's essentially the 1838 problem all over again, being structurally locked out of land ownership, but this time by algorithms instead of plantation owners.
That is exactly the same underlying mechanic. And this is why the author insists that faith and tradition aren't excuses to resist progress.
Right, they're anchors.
Yes, they act as moral compasses to navigate the uncharted maps of a new technological age. Samuel Sharp was a Baptist deacon, and it was faith that built those free villages.
So if the historical lesson of the free villages was that true freedom requires secure land ownership, how does that apply to a diaspora buyer today? Because entering the digital real estate market without proper legal titles is like building on that same unfinished, unstable foundation.
The article actually issues a very practical modern warning for the diaspora. Enthusiasm and patriotism are no substitute for due diligence.
Huh.
Don't buy property without properly examining the title with professional help.
Because a lot of land is family land, right?
Exactly. Property passed down through generations without formal registered deeds. When a diaspora buyer tries to purchase this land using modern PropTech platforms, the legal clash between customary ownership and digital registries can lead to massive financial losses.
So securing a clear, legally vetted title is really the only way to actually protect that piece of the unfinished house for the next generation.
Absolutely.
So to bring this all together for you listening, freedom isn't some dusty historical monument that you just look at once a year on August 1st. It's a living house.
Yeah, and it needs constant maintenance, repair, and expansion.
Exactly. Whether you are looking at investing in real estate, catching up on global news and UN resolutions, or just trying to wrap your head around historical economics, this deep dive shows how the past is actively shaping the laws and the digital landscapes of our world today.
The past is never really past. It just changes form. And there's one final subtle point from the text that we didn't fully unpack earlier, which leaves us with a lot to ponder.
Oh, what's that?
It's the intertwining of reparations and Jamaica's unresolved status as a republic. We talked about how the modern reparations movement is legally tied to a petition sitting on King Charles III's desk right now.
Right, petitioning the crown.
But Jamaica is actively in the process of transitioning to a republic, which means eventually removing the British monarch as head of state entirely.
So, if the very foundation of Jamaica's historical freedom is legally tied to a petition sitting on the king's desk right now, how will the eventual inevitable push to remove the British monarch as head of state fundamentally change the architecture of Jamaica's unfinished house?
When you finally take the old roof off, what does the newly finished structure look like?
That is a brilliant and provocative question to end on. We are all living in houses built on the foundations of the past. The challenge is ensuring the legal and cultural walls we are framing today are strong enough for the future. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, and as always, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep exploring.